After the latest armed conflict broke out in Sudan, the humanitarian situation in neighboring South Sudan has reached a critical stage. Tens of thousands of South Sudan refugees, including vulnerable children and women who have been seeking help in Sudan, are forced to return home in distress. Unfortunately, prior to the Sudan crisis, South Sudan has been already in a humanitarian crisis for years. So what is the current situation in terms of women and children in South Sudan? How does the Sudan conflict exacerbate the situation? What's ensured and what can the international community offer? I had the opportunity to sit down with Emma Tug, joining me from Juba, capital of South Sudan, who is emergency specialist for UNICEF in South Sudan. She worked in humanitarian field for over 14 years, including positions in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Turkey, as well as Nepal and other African areas. Let's listen to what she had to say. So I'm pleased to be joined from Juba, South Sudan by Emma Tug, Emergency Specialist of the United Nations Children's Fund in South Sudan. First of all, help us understand, how heavy was your work before the conflict started in Sudan?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for having us on the show. Already in South Sudan, we were suffering major humanitarian crises and situations affecting women and children. Already this year, let me give you some examples. We've had a major conflict in the northeast of the country, with over 50,000 people displaced from that conflict. Already 9.4 million people and 5 million children were in need of humanitarian assistance. That's life-saving support and assistance that was needed to help them meet their basic needs. That's because of conflict, that's because of the economic situation, and because of the major impacts of climate change that we've been seeing across the country.
Give people a different kind of idea of what exactly do you mean when you say some 5 million children were already in need of help before the conflict started. What kind of situation, how is life like in South Sudan, for instance?
Yeah. I mean, let's take healthcare, for example. Only 60% of health facilities across the country are functioning, and the health systems are struggling to meet what the needs of the populations. We see preventable diseases killing children, sadly, every day: malaria, diarrhea. To give a very shocking statistic, one in 10 children die before their 5th birthday. So that's where we are in some of the basic standards. Already 3 million children were out of schools, and that's because of conflicts preventing access to some schools damaged and closed due to floods. Over 800 schools were closed last year due to floods, as well as poverty and school dropouts and disease that means that children are unable to attend schools.
So how bad is the situation now with the conflict in Sudan driving people away from their homes? I see a UNICEF report on the 12th of May, for instance, saying that at least 450,000 children are being forced to flee their homes from the violence in Sudan. How much of that is being felt across the border in South Sudan?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, South Sudan and Sudan were one country in very recent history, so there is huge ties between the two, both in terms of population, but also in terms of trade. Food that comes from Sudan, people who cross the border daily, regularly for their trade and their basic needs. So many are returning to South Sudan. To date, 57,000 have already crossed the border. The majority of those were South Sudanese who were refugees in Sudan. So they'd fled conflict from South Sudan for safety in Sudan, and now they're having to flee back. Some of them are finding that their homes are no longer there, or they're finding that they're arriving into places with no support, no facilities, and no healthcare. So out of those, we're already seeing at least 50%, so around 25,000 are children, and also a large percentage are women. So women and children who are crossing the border. And actually, the conditions of people arriving, I mean, you can imagine having fled war. You can imagine running from your home and not being able to carry all your possessions. not being able to access banks to take money as you come. So the conditions of women and children when they're reaching the borders on this side, we're seeing high levels of hunger, high levels of malnutrition, disease, diarrhea. So people are coming in very, very vulnerable conditions and need urgent assistance when they arrive.
How would you describe the situation then? I mean, you have been having to deal with this situation and rather unknown to the outside world. Everybody being fixated on their own problems. Other regions in other parts of the world, not much is talked about. How would you describe the situation to tell people exactly where you are?
Yeah. Well, I think some of the photos of people arriving on the borders that have been circulating on media kind of speak for themselves. And let me just describe. I was up on the border on the eastern side of the country, a place called Renk, last week. And when you're there, you're under the heat, incredible heat. And the host communities are there who already are very vulnerable. Their prices in the market have soared. So you see that host communities are struggling. Then you see carts and buses, donkey-pulled carts with children on the back, buses with people piled high over the top, hundreds of people crammed into small buses, and women and children who have been out under that heat for days, sometimes weeks, having fled their homes. And as they arrive, humanitarian agencies and the government are working their hardest to provide services and facilities. But the time it takes, it's not been enough to reach every person immediately. So this effort to scale up is essential to make sure that we can meet everybody. But the conditions at the border are very hard in terms of access. We're talking about very remote border locations, some areas only accessible by flight, by helicopter, some only by boat. So it's really a challenging operation, and the teams up there who are working and the populations who are arriving are really suffering under very hard conditions.
What does that tell you about the severity of the situation in Sudan? Do you see any signs that the situation may be slowly alleviating as both sides are entering into talks, however difficult that may be?
Well, we have a UNICEF presence in Sudan, and we've had large programs across the country. The teams have been able to mobilize a response, and they are working across our sectors to mobilize to support those in need. But the situation inside the country, from what we understand from our colleagues in the north, is really alarming. And the markets are not functioning also, the health facilities are not functioning, and many, up to millions, are displaced already, even pre-conflict. So you're adding further displacement. So those who are remaining inside are also really struggling to meet their basic needs, even those outside of the direct conflict zones, because systems are breaking down. So we're seeing on both sides the situation has a huge humanitarian impact. In terms of how the conflict has affected how it may be shifting, we are seeing fewer numbers of people arriving day by day, but that doesn't necessarily dictate an ease in conflict. That might be a change in their ability to access this border point. They might be shifting to other border points. It might be safer for them to stay where they are currently. So it's all extremely dynamic at the moment.
What are you calling on the international community to do to help you deal with this crisis, with the crisis upon a crisis, and what have been the reception so far?
I think the immediate things, and as been spoken by the UN, is the immediate ceasefire, cessation of hostilities, enabling humanitarian response in all areas on all sides of the border, and within the country, enabling fair and free access for populations to reach that response and to equally have their basic needs, for humanitarians to be able to move safely across Sudan and across the countries affected so that they can provide it. So far, there is a huge support from the humanitarian, from the international community. But as we see, the conflict is continuing and the needs of people are rising day by day. So this support needs to intensify. And it also needs financial support. Already, maybe just to give you some numbers, our humanitarian response plan for South Sudan, pre the Sudan crisis, was only 28% funded. Now we're in May, so you're almost halfway through the year, and we had only reached 20% of our funding requirements to meet the basic needs of the 5 million children in need here. Now, with this additional crisis on top of that, without additional funds, as well as funding our existing response plan, we're really going to see quite a drastic deterioration in the situation.
Is financial distress the biggest challenge for you now?
It's one of the biggest. It's becoming a barrier to some response, especially now as in some areas we're having to establish new camps. So this requires a larger amount of funds as a startup. And with inflation rising, the cost of doing business is increasing. So without further funds, it's really going to be a challenge for the humanitarian community.
What is the next biggest challenge you can think of you want to mention here?
I would say two things. One is the economic situation. With the conflict in Sudan, how it's impacted the economy here, how it impacts food availability and food prices, and the knock-on effects of the fuel. We're already having populations in pre-famine conditions. Mm-hmm. Now, with this impact on the markets, we're going to see very quickly in the coming few months and into the end of the year that malnutrition rates are going to increase even further. And we already have extremely high severe acute malnutrition. So the economic impact is one of the biggest challenges. The second is climate. So as we approach within the next 1 month, the rainy season, it's estimated 1 million people are going to be affected by floods. Large areas of the country are still underwater from the rains from last year, and we're expecting to see that impact spread further.
My last question, Ms. Tuck, people would love to help, but they would also love to hear a little bit of optimism, even in the slightest sense. Is there anything you can provide people that there is hope, that people are trying, a slightest sense of optimism to leave this interview with? I don't know whether you can find any.
No, there definitely is. And one thing is the ability of the humanitarian community and its resilience, and the population's ability and their resilience to adapt and respond. The flexibility that we've seen and the collaboration between the government and the humanitarian community to rapidly scale up to this evolving situation. Children on the border are immediately being screened and they're receiving treatment for malnutrition. Children are receiving care for diarrhea the minute they reach the border. We're seeing cases where people have recovered from disease as they arrive. Food is being distributed. So there has been an epic scale up from the humanitarian community. And we're seeing children who have been unaccompanied or separated from their families through the crisis already being reunited with their families. So identifying the families of missing and lost children and already reunifying them at this early stage is really exceptional.
That's great news. Thank you so much for persevering in hardships and doing your job. Emma Tuck, Emergency Specialist of UNICEF in South Sudan, joining us from Juba. That's it for this edition of The Point. With me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got The Point.